As a kid, did you ever watch the Animaniacs?
Yes, of
Okay,
course.
we were barely allowed to watch it, and it was usually like on the DL, like, we'd slide it in. But one of my favorite parts of it was Pinky and the Brain. Do you remember Pinky and the Brain?
Pinky and the brain.
Brain, brain. And part of it is that I thought it was so funny what they always said. The slogan of it. Do you remember the slogan of it?
The what are we gonna do today? The
We're gonna
same
try
thing you do
every day. Try to take over the world. That's what I think we should talk about today.
Welcome to ManageCast Podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Katrina Purcell.
And I'm Rachel Anderson.
And today we're talking about what it really takes for startups to go global. Let's be honest, breaking into any market is tough. Breaking into multiple markets with different languages, cultures, and expectations, that is definitely Pinky and the Brain level.
Yes.
So Rachel, tell me, what do Notion, Duolingo, and Wise all have in common? Although, are we talking about Wise potato chips? Or are we talking about
I wish Wise potato chips. No, we're talking about Wise, the money transfer bank portfolio thing. They used to be called, I don't know, TimeWise or something. But they all had very, very strategic and successful global strategies almost from the get-go, and you could see it happen. And so that's what I really thought we could dive into. How do these brands that we know are around the globe and that are very successful being around the globe, how can we put that into the sauce as we build our companies?
So, having worked at a lot of global brands who have obviously built those brands over years and years and years, what makes building a global brand especially challenging for startups, other than the fact that they have not been around for years to establish that reputation for being global?
Yeah, that's definitely the first thing is listen, you got to play in the pool you've gotten, right? You're not around for years. You're not going to win based on longevity of time and small scale. So I don't think we should talk about that because that's not the kind of brand or business that I think is ideal for this conversation because you're clearly not a startup anymore. The startups that I want to talk about specifically are the ones that have that big global vision. You could go global. You could serve an international audience. You could do these things and you know it from the get-go. And there's a ton of startups. You and I actually talked to one business owner when we were in South by Southwest a few months ago that was based in the US, but he primarily was launching his product in any area of the world that had a natural disaster. That's everywhere, right? Right from the get-go, that's your ideal client. So how do you really, as a startup, tackle wanting to be global or knowing that you could be global? And that's where the hurdle starts. So the first thing is that you just have to acknowledge your current limitations, which is that you're not in business very long and you have limited resources. You might have small teams or tight budgets. You're going to have that low scale, even brand recognition. So you're going to have to work on other things that make you a differentiated company to work with rather than we've been around for 20 years or 50 years and are highly trusted. You also have to accept or be very cognizant of the cultural nuances in other places, depending on what your product is or your service is. That messaging doesn't always translate. So you have to get rid of thinking that there's going to be a one size fits all to your scale. It's just not going to happen. There's, of course, regulatory compliance. Maybe there's laws, different things there you have to play with. There's logistical scale. So if you're shipping something or you're hiring or you're managing, all of those on a global scale get very tricky. And there's a lot of nuance there, which we'll talk about a little bit about what you do. And then, of course, that trust and credibility. Most businesses, especially today when budgets get tight or things get really overwhelming with decisions, will fall back into going with people that they know. And sometimes you know a brand based on their reputation rather than a personal connection. And sometimes you go with the personal connection. And so these are all things that if you're doing a SWOT analysis at the very get-go, just put all these hurdles down and acknowledge that you have to find a way to either work around these or work with these as you go towards making plans.
So what steps can these early stage companies take to position themselves if they've decided that international growth is that vision? What are the steps that they need to take to start actually making that a reality?
Yeah, you don't have to do these exactly in order, but these are all things that I think that you're going to really need to do to set yourself up well before you tackle the idea of global in a serious capacity. So the first is that you need to be able to build a brand that travels well. So does your brand communicate without words? That's the number one question I think I would ask the company, because words statistically are only 30% of your communication. 70% of it is nonverbal. And so for a company, this is a great success for you because that means you can really deep dive in or highlight your visual aspects of your brand. Think about all the ways you can communicate without actually using words. And if you set up your initial, I don't want to just use it for marketing because it's everything, right? It's sort of like your imprint of who you are as a company. But if you do all of that design first, then you're going to have a really like good advantage in the market once it comes to addressing some of the more nuances in messaging and things. The second is that you want to start with some really key markets. Maybe choose one or two places that have a really good stronghold for you in the service you want to be in, or the industry or the product, and prove yourself in those markets first so that you can use it as leverage when you go to smaller markets or different markets, that you were able to succeed in this like big player place. A great example is actually from my own personal history. When I was working with a startup, it was in the wine industry. It was very fun. That's a whole nother, I could probably talk the whole episode just about this experience. But one of the things that we were doing as part of my strategic plan for how we grew and scale was that we were going to tackle Napa Valley first, because it is the number one place in the US when you think about wine. There is no alternative, hands down. But then our second number two place was going to be Washington, because they actually have a fairly like good group of wineries up there in that Washington.
The Willamette Valley is one of my favorite.
Right. I know it. I feel like it's really underrated. And then we were going to launch into France, because that way we could really prove it out in a main market and a secondary market and know that it had the strength to go to like a huge player in another country. And so that was a way that we used that like major market momentum to be able to expand and think about how we would do something on a global scale. And the other thing you can do is invest early in kind of cultural research or even local expertise. So from the get-go, have learning, education, consultants, agencies in other places that can give you that expertise to learn and experience. Also use platforms and technology that already have that built-in global reach. There's one product that a business owner and I were discussing the other day that already ran taxes for you based on where the people were at, rather than just like a one and done in the US, which was so important for their ability to scale beyond just where the US was, even if that meant their like percentage off the top for every transaction was slightly more, but it set them up right away for not having to then rip out their solution, put in a new one, do the research later, all the stuff that ends up kind of being a wash in the end on that percentage exchange. And then finally, just from the get-go, plan for scale. Just plan for scale, right? Right away. What does it look like for us to get from A to B? And that's going to be in your typical three things: people, processes, and technology. How do we make sure that while we look at growth, we're setting ourselves up to be able to do this as part of the assumptive success, rather than thinking of it as like we'll get there and deal with it when it happens.
Right. So what are the proven best practices though? And how long can this really take? If I'm starting out and I've picked my key markets, what are the things that I have to do? And about how long should I expect it to take?
Yeah. So this is where Notion and Wise, which is actually TransferWise, I remembered what their real name used to be. Wise, and even Duolingo did. Like Notion built a global tool, but thought about it in a way where it was really localized after they had this like global spread. So the first thing I would say is start local, but act global. There's very few brands. Notion is the exception. They went global first and then like localized their language and their different things. But most brands are more successful in starting local, keeping consistency, figuring out the basic things, and then scaling up. And they would adapt where it matters. Obviously, that's highly dependent on your product or service, but generally. And the other thing is that you should prioritize localization, not just translation. So when we talk about that, we talk about this a lot in marketing, because I've worked with and for a lot of companies that were already global. And we would translate a lot of their materials into whatever the local language was, so that they could have an easier time of understanding the technical specs or the value propositions or whatever that was, right, of our information. But that has to be localized for wider spread when you're thinking about a full business in pricing. $1 here isn't $1 of value somewhere else. Maybe $1 here is actually 25 cents of value in another country. So pricing needs to be localized, not translated. UX, the way someone moves and behaves here, doesn't translate. The easiest example is that, in the US, we read left to right, but in other countries, they read right to left. And so again, translation is not sufficient. It needs to be localization. Same with customer service tone, how you address customers, where you put things. It's the whole gamut that you really need to think about. The other part of kind of best practice suggestions is to find ways to get social proof early. So as you're starting to break in, maybe it's one free customer to get that as an exchange for a case study or a testimonial of someone in that local area, and really trying to use that to its fullest extent. And then finally, if you're going to go a paid route, make sure that your paid digital or even an influencer strategy is really, really thought through, especially in consumer goods or apps. Otherwise, you're going to end up spending tons of money for very little return because you're not using the cultural context for what is successful or valuable. And so in that way, timelines can be really super different. If you're building a product that is global from the get-go, I'm going to say you need at least 3 years to fully do what you need to do. Thinking about that first year is just laying foundations and testing things and figuring out what are the markets internationally that are sort of primed for us, the most easy. The next year being what's our localization strategy? So how do we make sure that what we have to offer is not translated, but localized? And then in that last year, actually putting the effort behind to scale and grow in those locations. So that does kind of assume that you sort of have a baseline already set here, or that from the get-go, you are your customer is international, but it's going to take a lot of time. And this is not a quick win. So you need to be prepared for a long-term strategy, not short-term endeavors.
The thing that always gets me is dates. You can always tell very easily where something started, whether you put the month first or the day first.
Yes.
Yeah,
100%. And it is
very
tricky when
easy
it's
way.
12/11.
It's always a very easy way for me to be able to tell, where did this company actually start? How do they think about the date? Well, this has been a very interesting episode of Taking Over the World on Managed Chaos Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. You can follow and subscribe on YouTube to help us reach our goal of, 5,000 followers. We need a lot of help. Please go follow us on YouTube. You can also follow and subscribe on wherever you like to listen to your podcast, and we will talk to you on the next episode of Managed Chaos Podcast.